Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lecture series here. We are so excited to introduce Nicholas Hartlip. He's the Robert Charles Billings Chair in Education at Berea College, where he chairs the Education Studies Department. His research focuses on the model minority stereotype of Asian Americans. That's how I actually found him to begin with. I saw an awesome video that he was doing. His latest book is on racial battle fatigue and faculty perspectives and lessons from higher education. I'm going to let him do some introductions and also talk about his fun Saturday video series so we can all follow him on YouTube. So yeah, without further ado, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So today we have about 60 minutes to talk about this topic of the model minority stereotype, and I've titled today's conversation Sinophobia and Anti-Asian Racism in the United States, and subtitled Understanding Modern Model Minority Stereotypes. So just an overview of what I want to accomplish today in this short time. In essence, I want to talk about how I see Asian Americans and their stereotypes interconnected to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia here in a US context. And specifically, I want to address how nasty talk and racist love is levied against Asian Americans and how widespread these forms of communication are, especially during the Trump presidency and the COVID-19 pandemic. So as Hannah said, I'm a recent transplant. I was at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I just started this past fall at Berea College. And Berea College is a really special and interesting place. You should look it up after the talk. It's a labor college. And so the students don't pay tuition. They graduate with little to no student loan debt. And they have to work, which helps offset and helps fund their scholarships. And, you know, as someone with a working class background, to me, work is just part of who I am. So I always start with thinking about, like, who am I and why do I have an authority to talk about this topic, right? And so I've done a lot of work on this topic of the model minority stereotype. And certainly I want at the end to, we'll turn the recording off, but ask me questions, push back about against anything I've said that you disagree with, and hopefully we can further our understanding in mutually beneficial ways. But I've dedicated quite some time to researching the topic. As Hannah said, I started a new YouTube channel, the Model Minority Stereotype Project. Every Saturday, I'm trying to commit to releasing a video. You should check it out and subscribe. Okay, so let's start. Here you have a tweet from Donald J. Trump. And in the tweet, it says, the United States will be powerfully supporting those industries like airlines and others that are particularly affected by the Chinese virus. We will be stronger than ever before. And so if you haven't cued in, this is a problem when the president of the free world uses the language of Chinese virus.
So what is in a name? Previous pandemics and outbreaks have taken on the names of places, but doing so has consequences. Experts say naming novel coronavirus the Chinese virus isn't just wrong, it also jeopardizes the safety of Asians here in the Bay Area and around the globe. The first case of novel coronavirus was reported in Wuhan, China in December 2019. Those early cases have been linked to a live animal market in Wuhan and has since spread person to person. The virus has since spread around the globe, first showing up in the United States on January 2nd, 2020 in Snohomish County, Washington.
It's called COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. It is not called the China virus, the Chinese virus, or the Wuhan virus.
Dr. Alok Patel is part of ABC7's team of coronavirus experts. We asked him to break down the name of the virus to help us better understand where the name really comes from. Some people have assumed the C in COVID-19 means it came from China.
No, the C stands for coronavirus. Here's the thing. The virus doesn't discriminate or differentiate based on race or ethnicity or where you come from. So we shouldn't either.
The corona in coronavirus actually comes from what the virus looks like.
Under a microscope, the virus has these little proteins that stick out of it, and it kind of looks like the crown of the sun, the corona.
The novel coronavirus is the name of the virus.
The disease it causes is called COVID-19. Corona, VI, virus, D, disease, 2019. There you have it.
Virus outbreaks are often given common names, but they come with stigma and social consequences. There was the swine flu in 2009 that started in the U.S. and mad cow disease in the United Kingdom. Both outbreaks impacted the sales of pork and beef. The Asian flu in 1957, the Hong Kong flu in 1968, Ebola, named for the Ebola River in Africa, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, MERS, was first reported in 2012 in Saudi Arabia. Sometimes the name gets it wrong. The Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people in 1918. Scientists now believe it actually started in Kansas, but got its name from the huge number of people in Spain who died from the flu strain.
We never called the 2015 measles outbreak the Southern California unvaccinated virus. That wouldn't have been appropriate.
That's why the World Health Organization, top health experts with the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Institutes of Health are urging people to use the correct name for this pandemic, COVID-19.
But here's the thing. We live in a different time now. And people can say all they want, hey, in the past, they've named these viruses after geographical locations. What we'll say back to them is, yes, but with outbreaks in this world, we see associated racism. And we see associated prejudice. So why don't we learn from the past, and why don't we set a new standard and actually get everyone on board with a more scientific process? And that's called calling the virus by its actual scientific name, SARS-CoV-2, and calling the disease COVID-19.
So I think this video captures a lot. When I've shared this information with some friends and colleagues, they didn't even know why it was called COVID-19. They thought it was some molecular thing, right? And so he points out some good considerations. However, I want to problematize it and say President Trump is not just following patterns, he's intentionally using this language. What you have on your screen is a verifiable, and the verified is the green circle with the check mark, independent fact checking that showed that this picture is authentic. It was taken during a briefing where President Trump crossed off with a marker corona and replaced the words Chinese virus there. So if it's intentional, you know, I think we need to think about what the medical doctor said in the previous video. Can we learn from our past? Should we stop using the language? And what has happened over time? So when we look back over time, I want to share a quote by a person there in California, Leland Stanford. He was the 8th governor of your great state. And in 1862, during his inaugural gubernatorial address, he shared this quotation. The yellow is pretty problematic in my eyes.
While the settlement of our state is of the first importance, the character of those who shall become settlers is worthy of scarcely less consideration. To my mind it is clear that the settlement among us of an inferior race is to be discouraged by every legitimate means. Asia, with her numberless millions, sends to our shores the dregs of her population. Large numbers of this class are already here, and, unless we do something early to check their immigration, the question, which of the two tides of immigration, meeting upon the shores of the Pacific, shall be turned back, will be forced upon our consideration, when far more difficult than now of disposal. There can be no doubt but that the presence of numbers among us of a degraded and distinct people must exercise a deleterious influence upon the superior race, and, to a certain extent, repel desirable immigration. It will afford me great pleasure to concur with the legislature in any constitutional action, having for its object the repression of the immigration of the Asiatic races.
So the xenophobia occurring at this time in our historical record was building, and obviously at a crescendo, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So when we think about the modern stereotype of Asians, we think of many times the high achieving, elite educated Asian American student. But in the language that Mr. Stanford was using at the time about inferior race, he was positioning inferiority of Asian race and Chinese to the superior race of the white European American at the time. So when we think about the mono-minority stereotype, I want to think about the ways we see Asian Americans and people, and understand that the way we see people and Asian Americans is shaped by discourse. So what happens when President Trump repeatedly says the Chinese virus or China?
Let's say China. China, 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 China. You go over to China, 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 China. You take China. 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 I love them. China, 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 China. I have to have my China. China, China, because China, 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 China. China, 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 China now, China, China. You know, China. I know China very well. China, China, China.
You get this Sinophobia, and you get attributions that are not accurate. So as the first video showed, the medical doctor talking about where these diseases and viruses emanate from. So discourse certainly comes from the president, his voice, repeatedly saying things at briefings, anytime he talks, tweets. But another way that discourse is perpetuated is through the media. And the media saturates us with images of East Asians wearing masks. And so when you think about this quote is an excerpt from an article that was written in the 2000s when the SARS outbreak occurred. And here again, why I point out, and I'm using this visual in Zoom, is as a Korean man, my eyes, the mask covers your face, but our eyes and other, our facial features make us very identifiable under masks. And so even in the video of the medical doctor talking, there is a clip where there were Asians in the background wearing masks. And so discourse is further perpetuated by the media with images. So it can be verbally, it can be pictorial, visual, and it can be textual, and also pictures of those political cartoons. So I want to talk to you a little bit about nasty talk and how we talk about Asian Americans nastily. When this stereotype was created, and it was created in 1966. There was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. His name was William Peterson. And Peterson wrote an article that appeared in the New York Times magazine, entitled Success Story, Japanese American Style. And in that magazine story, he applauded Japanese for doing wonderful things, for, despite being interned, just working quietly and achieving the American dream. But there's a pre-story to the Peterson story that I'd like to tell you for a moment. And that is, a year before, in 1965, then Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, wrote an infamous report that's commonly referred to as the Moynihan Report. And in that report, essentially said that African Americans had a culture that explained why they were why they weren't being successful. So if that is the first story, African Americans are not successful because of their culture. And then chapter 2 of that story is that Asians are successful because of their culture. The takeaway message is that in America, you can achieve your dreams if you only work hard. And it really absolves America from having to deal with the challenges of racism and discrimination. That's why I say it. Now, certainly, we talk nasty about Asians, and we do sound racist at times. Here you have a Korean patron who visits Starbucks and receives their cappuccino, mocha, something, an expensive, overpriced drink, right? And they have chinky eyes on it. Now, I'm glad to say I've never experienced that, but those are very overt ways. Here you have examples of receipts. If you have ever gone to Papa John's and ordered a pizza, right? And here again, lady, chinky eyes, ching chong on the receipt. Racist receipts are clearly ways we talk nasty about Asians, and we do sound racist. I'm here to suggest that positive stereotypes, though, are ways we talk nasty about Asians without appearing to be racist. That the model minority stereotype, in fact, is a racist construct. An app on Google Play, so a few years ago, the Make Me Asian app. Last week was Halloween, and if you celebrate Halloween and you see the costume shops, there is no shortage of costumes mocking Asians. We talk nasty about Asians in many ways, and we do sound racist, but I'm here to tell you of a few of the ways that we talk nasty about Asians without sounding racist. In July of 2013, there was an airplane crash in San Francisco, Asiana Flight 214. It hit the seawall. This was from the news, supposedly the accurate names of the pilots. Clearly, there is something amiss here, isn't there? Captain Something Wong, Wee Tu Lo, Holy Fuck, Bang Ding Ao. Now, I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt to the person who made the mock name, and just supposedly that he or she didn't know. The person who actually did this was fired. This might have been unintentional. This was interesting, given that this is Chicagoland. The Chicago Sun-Times had a front page headline that said Fright 214. If you don't get why this might be offensive to Asian people in America, it is the substitution of the letter R for L, flight and fright. Now, certainly I see the pun, the play on words, that it might have been frightening to be on that aircraft when it crashed. I understand that. But I also understand as a Korean, that yellow voice, the mocking of the Asian language is very prevalent in media. The Simpsons, Family Guy, and here even the newspaper. Again, this might be unintentional. What about Jeremy Lin? When Jeremy Lin was doing very well, and when Linsanity was beginning to sweep across this nation, ESPN website, their website, had this headline or this subtitle, and it was Chink in the Armor. Jeremy had a bad game, and they were saying, right, that he was the weakness, a weak spot in the Knicks' loss. But if you don't know anything about Asians, chink is not a term that we should use and treat so delicately. Again, this might be unintentional. I don't know. Again, a play on words.
But I am acutely aware that there are ways that we talk nasty about Asians in a very intentional way. If you're an alum of UCLA, are there any alums of UCLA? Raise your hand. Any Bruins? Well, UCLA has been referred to as United Caucasians lost among Asians. That play on words, that snide slogan, implies that the white students at UCLA are being overtaken by Asian students. You see, if Asian Americans are model minorities and they're doing so well, that can be a double-edged sword. Their success can be used against them, right? Any alumni of Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the room? Made in Taiwan is another play on words. Again, if Asians are taking over the campus of an elite university at MIT, then it implies that whites are being subjected and are victims of Asian success. In my own research, I've found this of surveys of college students, and that if Asians are thought to be competitors, that attitudes towards them will become more negative over time. Here's an example from Canada, the University of a Billion Chinese, standing for the University of British Columbia. The Canadians have imported the model minority stereotype from us, which began in 1966, vis-a-vis William Peterson.
So some of my research now has taken me to Germany. I've published a piece that looks at the Vietnamese in Germany. Much of the model minority stereotype research hasn't been very, hasn't continued to develop and evolve. So in terms of the sociology, I've tried to internationalize that work. So in terms of the coded language and the way we talk nasty about Asians, it's important to think about context. And so the model minority stereotype of Asian Americans is interconnected to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in the United States. The model minority stereotype is a constellation of many stereotypes and tropes, such as Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners and or a yellow peril for white Americans. And right now we're seeing that. We see the Chinese being scapegoated by the Trump presidency. So it's important for us to first think of this interconnection of the word xenophobia. Xenophobia comes from the Greek words xenos, which refers to stranger or guest, and phobos, fear or flight. And so here we have an example of perpetual foreigners. You know, the fact that we're marked as foreigners, even though you might be born there in sunny California, right? And also this fear, this yellow peril. Here you have an example of a historical artifact that shows that this is not new behavior by society. We have an example of an image to the left of the screen that shows the dominant public opinion of 3 diseases that were supposedly the fault of Chinese immigrants and their families. So this was in 1882, right during the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, by the way, really wasn't repealed until 1942. So here you have an example. This is not new to tie disease, sickness, illness, maladies with the Chinese. Now, if we think about President Trump's behavior, I opened by showing a note with him intentionally crossing off Corona and replacing it with Chinese. Trump also, besides briefings, talks via tweets. And here is a tweet that I want to share with you.
To everyone, you should come to Chinatown. Precautions have been taken by our city. We know that there's a concern about tourism traveling all throughout the world, but we think it's very safe to be in Chinatown and hope that others will come.
So here you have an example of Trump conflating, right, a Chinatown to China, and there is a mixturing in the discourse of who is Chinese American, where is, you know, a hot spot of this global pandemic in China. He talks about shutting down immigration. So there again, we get an example of the discourse that many people follow, and you can even see in the image how many likes that tweet got. But you have an example of discourse of the text he's writing, as well as the video of Nancy Pelosi. So we talk nasty about Asians. I want now to talk a little bit about racist love. And Frank Chin, and this is a idea that Chin and Chan in 1972 put forth, of this idea of racist love. And if you were to read that book chapter, you would really understand that it's not white supremacy's love for Asian Americans as the model minority stereotype suggests. It is an honorary whiteness. It's actually a hatred of blackness. And so our Asian Americans, our love that we receive comes at the expense of hatred towards blacks. However, here you have an example of, I'm part of a social media Facebook group, Violence Against Asian Americans. You have this example of a man wearing a mask and it says, "Thanks, Chinks." And so that's very violent to me. If I were in a store and see that, I would be deathly afraid. And so I want to play this video. I mentioned in the beginning that I relocated from Minnesota. And so this town was, the video that I'm going to share with you happened maybe 7 minutes from my house, my former house.
A Twin Cities couple says they are sad and angered by a racist note left on their door this week.
WCCO's Erin Hassansada explains why they're also grateful while urging others to come forward.
Couldn't believe it.
It's a little overwhelming.
When Alvin Moore returned home Wednesday, he noticed a piece of paper stuck to his front door in Woodbury.
I thought it might have been like a notice sign. As I got closer to it and actually read the note itself, yeah, it was pretty disturbing.
This is the note that was plastered on his front door. "We're watching you," it says, followed by a racial slur, and "Take the Chinese virus back to China." Alvin's emotions were racing.
Anger, frustration, a lot of anger.
It kind of, I guess, makes me sad. I don't know, because I would like to feel welcomed here. After alerting their landlord, he called the Woodbury police. The department tells us there are no leads, though detectives are working on it, adding, "This sort of behavior has no place in our community. We're saddened that a person would be so cruel as to racially blame a neighbor for COVID-19. That sentiment was echoed online. Venetia Yang's post drawing hundreds of supportive comments.
It's hard. You know, it just makes it a little harder to be Asian American.
Hopefully this behavior ends.
Though it's painful, Alvin and Venetia think it's important for us all to know about the hurtful things that are happening close to home.
Please don't be afraid to share your story. I mean, we need to spread the awareness because obviously there are people out there who care.
In Woodbury, Erin Hassansada, WCCO4 News.
The mayor of Woodbury apologized to the couple on behalf of the city. The mayor encouraged victims or anyone else aware of these incidents to call 911.
And so part of the violence that Asian Americans receive, being scapegoated, and also in other ways of oppression, is that system of oppression revolves around Asian Americans being stereotyped as being passive and meek and non-political and non-active. And so by speaking out, this event is a great event where here in Asian Pacific American Month, talking about this topic. It's timely, COVID-19, but then also the intersection with Asian Americans and the model minority stereotype. This is a prime example of us talking about this problem. I talked about Chin and Chan's work in 1972 about racist love. And here is a short excerpt of them talking, Frank Chin talking about it.
We have to challenge the stereotype. We haven't gone out and discovered exactly what is a stereotype. We have to tell people, tell ourselves, define the stereotype. We have to prove that the stereotype is false. To prove the stereotype is false, we have to recover the history and the culture that the stereotype displaced or displaces. We have to, and that's a lot of work.
And it is a lot of work. And in my own research on the model minority stereotype, we've done what Chin is talking about, and we need to move on to then what is the next step? That's the million-dollar question. So when we think about how widespread is anti-Asian hatred, well, that's hard to quantify. But an interesting article written by Yves Talk entitled Suspending Damage, a Letter to Communities. She talks about the notion that research can be damaging. And so in particular, she talks here, and I quote, I'm here because I'm sickened by my potential to perpetuate this hateful part of US history. Here again, we arrive at a paradox of damage. To refute it, we need to say it out loud. And so I bolded those sentences in the area of the quote, because are we, by having to relive and talk about how the model minority stereotype is damaging, to refute it, are we in the process perpetuating damage and damaging narratives? And I don't know if there's a scholarly way to answer that question, and perhaps there isn't a direct answer. So maybe some would say yes, some would say no. But it is a grand question to ask, a beautiful question to ask, because it suggests we have to do more. And so if you were to read that article, she talks about desire-based narratives as her response to damaging narratives. I'll pass my slide here. So if we think about context for a moment, according to the dictionary, context is the part or parts of preceding or following a passage or word, helping to reveal its meaning. In the beginning of today's conversation, I shared how in '66, Peterson wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine. And the year before it, Daniel Patrick Moynihan had written a report. And so Moynihan's report came first. Peterson's report came next. There you have context. It helps reveal the meaning and the takeaway from those two stories. So modern scapegoating of China is politically convenient for the Trump presidency and his administration, but we need to examine the discourse and the context of the President of the United States' comments. And we're getting close to the end. Thanks for hanging in there with me.
Mr. President, just quickly, a second question. What prompted you to say at the beginning of your comments that you're going to take care of the Asian Americans? Has there been something in particular that was?
Yeah, because it seems that there could be a little bit of nasty language toward the Asian Americans in our country, and I don't like that at all. These are incredible people. They love our country, and I'm not going to let it happen. So I just wanted to make that point. Because they're blaming China. People are blaming China, and they are making statements to great American citizens that happen to be of Asian heritage, and I'm not going to let that happen.
So it's quite ironic, right, that he's saying that. He even used the term nasty. But that nastiness, here's an example of dog whistle politicking here. He is using, think of the speech, Corona, I'm going to say the Chinese virus. And then he is, in a sense, saying, oh, no, I'm here to protect Asian Americans. If the president wanted to protect Asian Americans, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing. And so I would just say, from my point of view, the evidence suggests he's intentionally using that language. So that's all I have. I'd love to open it up for questions, and this is my first Zoom presentation, so I hope I did okay for you all. And it looks like we have 22 minutes of time for question and answering. So I'm not sure how Hannah you want to proceed.
Yeah, so anyone who would like to speak, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you don't want to speak, you can chat also the questions you might have.